What's up, gamers? It's Joshi here, and we're here to talk about the new Dataslate that just came out on June 2024, and it was a doozy. There's so much in this most recent Dataslate because the Balanced Dataslate updated, the Munitorum Field Manual updated, the core rules updated, and also there are new changes in the index data cards FAQ and errata. Now, obviously, with the Pariah Nexus immediately on the horizon, there's a lot that's changing all at once in the game, and it's not just the guard that's changing. But today, we're going to be going over the rules and things that have changed and how they specifically affect guard. We're not really going to be talking about all the other changes to all the other armies because it's such a big shakeup. It's going to be really hard to understand exactly how it's going to be affecting everything. So to start with, obviously, if you've been watching the Officer Training School videos, thank you so much for tuning in. I did what I could to make sure that they would be evergreen and still useful after every data slate. However, this data slate was so big. It's basically half an edition change in a lot of ways. And I want to say that right now, I'd say like 90 to 95% of most of those videos are still accurate. The big things that I would really focus on are the fact that reinforcements is no longer working the way it used to when I was recording all these videos. And also, I remember in particular a couple things that I was saying about the Rogal Dorn and how big it was has also changed. So you can actually be a lot more mobile with your Rogal Dorns now than you were previous to this status slate. We'll talk a bit more about any other changes that we got towards the end, but I would still say like if you are trying to learn to play more competitive 40k, 90+% of the things in those videos are still accurate. So just make sure you understand the couple of changes that have come up that will change what I would have said about them. Also, I'm not really one for a lot of hot takes. My process for all the videos in the past has always been I come up with like 90% of the script myself, and then I will go and show that script to a couple other strong players and be like, hey, does this make sense? Does this check out with what you're used to? And then we can edit that and put in a couple more tips and tricks that they tell me along the way. So throughout the course of this, as we get towards the end, I will be talking about a couple things that I am curious about, I'm interested in, but not necessarily committed to. During the rules section, it's mostly going to be kind of advised, but towards the end, when I start talking about what I'm kind of expecting will be good then, and I want to get this out of the way now before people start taking it as gospel. So I'm gonna do my best to try and make this go in a logical order, but it is very much a stream of consciousness, and we'll see how much work editing Joshi is willing to do later. So to start with, let's go ahead and take a look at the data slate. The army role voice of command in here in the data slate, as far as I can tell, did not change from the last version to the current version. However, our detachment rule did change very significantly. Born soldiers has two important clauses. The first one, each time a model in a regiment unit from your army makes a ranged attack that targets a visible unit, excluding monsters and vehicles, that attack has the lethal hits ability. This part of the rule is okay. It'll be very relevant shooting at like Orc Boys or Custodes Wardens. However, a lot of our regiment units don't really do a whole lot of damage anyway. The ones that were going to be doing damage were going to do damage anyway. So this is a nice change, but it's not necessarily going to be game breaking. However, the one that is really big is the second part of it. Each time a model in a squadron unit from your army makes a ranged attack that targets a visible monster or vehicle unit, that attack has the lethal hits ability. This is really important because in most of our games, our squadron units were doing a large bulk of our damage. And previously, we weren't getting a whole lot of value from our rule simply because we weren't remaining stationary very often. It mostly would come up when we were already locked in combat with something or if we were shooting indirect. However, now we get it all the time, so we get the bonus of being able to move and also getting access to the lethal hits. However, there are a couple important clauses here. The first one is that the target needs to be visible, so our indirect is basically never getting access to lethal hits anymore. The second one is the limiting factor. The fact that our squadron units only get lethal hits against monsters and vehicles. However, I won't talk about this a whole lot, but the short version is there are a lot of changes in here which do, in fact, make vehicles and monsters way more reasonable to bring in the upcoming changes to the game. So, with more monsters and vehicles out there, suddenly, if our vehicles are doing bonus damage to their vehicles, it's going to help out quite a bit. Now, this is really important because it says squadron unit. It does not say vehicle unit. So, a couple of things that are coming up from this. One, because Sentinels are both regiment and squadron, our Sentinels will now get lethal hits against every target in the game. Suddenly, that makes plasma cannons way more interesting because we get the lethal hits going into vehicles and we don't need the reroll wounds as much from the armored. Also, the plasma cannons now just have the volume of fire to actually do some damage to things like Custodes. However, on the flip side, there are units in our army that do not have the squadron keyword. Most importantly, tank commanders and super heavies have no squadron keyword. This means that the tank commander will never get lethal hits against anything, nor will any of your Bane Blades or any of their chassis. On the one hand, this incentivizes you to move them every turn. On the other, it does mean that it's a slight downgrade for some of these units who would sometimes be getting lethal hits. The next thing I want to talk about comes in the errata of the index cards. Now, there's a bunch of small changes in here that I'm not sure exactly when they came out, because honestly, I didn't know this document existed. However, this one does come up. It does say for a voice of command, each officer's datasheet will specify how many orders it can issue in a battle round and which units are eligible to receive those orders. This clears up a couple of things. One, there is technically a rules as written interpretation that the voice of command rule specified how many orders an officer could give per game. Obviously, this interpretation was silly, and I've never seen it actually enforced, but it did exist. However, this might have a big impact on our ability to use inspired command. Whereas inspired command previously would let us use orders in our opponent's turn, and it was assumed that we could just do it as a bonus order. That is now in question. So we're going to have to wait for different TOs to rule on this, especially in competitive sense. Again, this channel is mostly focused on competitive play, but I would say that in house games, I would absolutely rule Inspired Command as giving you a bonus order. However, we might have to change that depending on how competitive you actually want to play. Okay, now those are the only changes that were specifically made to the Astra Militarum. However, there are a lot of changes that do change a lot of things that we have in our index anyway. And they start off right at the top of the balance dataslate. So the first one, modifying Stratagem's CP cost, affects Ursula Creed in particular, because it says that rules that enable you to target a unit from your army with a stratagem for 0 CP, but that do not specify the name of the stratagem, instead reduce the CP cost of that use of the stratagem by 1 CP. This mostly meant that we got to use Fields of Fire for free from Creed. However, that is no longer the case, because Fields of Fire costs 2 CP, it is now reduced by 1, so we'd still have to spend 1 CP to do it anyway, even with Ursula Creed. Importantly, though, this does not specify that it has to be used on battle tactics anymore. Previously, the suppression fire stratagem, I would consider it so bad that I almost never used it. I would use it maybe once in every 15 games, and that one time it did come up, it was really cool, but it was almost never relevant. However, now, if we can do it for free with Creed, this unlocks a couple of things. One, it's a great CP farm, because you can do it on these regiment units, and two, I mean, just having the ability to point and click and make things in your opponent's army -1 to hit is not bad. So suddenly, this stratagem that was so useless that we would never want to spend CP on it, suddenly becomes, a potentially nice tool in the toolbox. Fields of Fire is, of course, not bad, but the fact that we now have to spend CP on it does make it very difficult to use. And we also cannot double up Fields of Fire anymore because we do not have anywhere in our index anything that says we can use Fields of Fire for free. So we could only ever use Fields of Fire once for 1 CP if we have Ursula Creed, and then potentially pair it up with things like the Exterminator or with the Hellhound. This puts a bit of an upper limit on how much damage we can actually do to things, but if you watched my video on the Luminar's Exterminator, you already know that the most important breakpoints in the game are getting to AP2, which we can still do with Fields of Fire and Exterminators, and AP3, because that puts things on invulns that generally have them. This next one is less important directly for the guard itself, but it is worth noting. If a model has a rule that would, once per battle, increase the CP cost of an opponent's stratagem, such as the Calidus Assassin's Reign of Confusion ability, that rule is replaced with the following. Lord Receipt Aura. Each time your opponent targets a unit from their army with a stratagem, if that unit is within 12 inches of this model, increase the cost of that use of that stratagem by 1 CP. This is an interesting change. Because CP usage across the board is going to go up, it becomes a very interesting spot of whether or not you want to do this. Now, the biggest thing is, one, you generally don't want your Calidus within 12 inches of things anyway. With the lone operative keyword, yes, the Calidus has Fight First and an Anti-Infantry 2+ Flamer, but if it's within 12 inches, it's probably going to die. However, we also have an enhancement called Kurov's Aquila, which costs 40 points, and was already not really brought in basically any army. In the previous April Dataslate, we only had 2 lists actually bring Kurov's Aquila to any events that did well. It wasn't unplayable, it was just you really needed a meta where that would be valuable. There's still maybe a world where you put this on like a tank commander and drive it up the board, but I would say that this largely kills our ability to affect our opponent's stratagem cost in any meaningful way. Now, the next part of this is, of course, stratagems that can be used more than once per phase or turn. Unless they specify the name of the stratagem that you're using, you can't do it anymore. So this kind of goes back to what we were talking about. You can only use Fields of Fire once per turn. Now, like I said, I'm going to be skipping over things that don't affect us directly. However, we do need to talk about stratagems that add new units to your army, because if a stratagem has the effect of adding a new unit to your army that is identical to your destroyed unit, for instance, join the hunt, unending waves, reinforcements, add the following restriction to that stratagem. You can only use this stratagem once per battle. And this is probably the biggest change that Guard is actually getting in this new data slate. I'll be honest, when I was building a list, I was always building it with the intention of trying to use reinforcements 3 or 4 times per game, getting me anywhere between an extra 3 and 500 points of stuff over the course of the game. On the January data slate, this was Khazarkin. On the April data slate, this was Rough Riders. And now we can only do that once per game. So we have to put a premium on what it is that we're trying to be bringing back. Or we can kind of ignore this and just kind of use it as a nice to have. This means that endlessly recycling Rough Riders is really difficult. Also, the Khazarkin are, not necessarily high enough value anymore that we necessarily want to be bringing them back over and over again. I've talked a lot in the past about Melee Guard and how players like Paul Clifton and Marshall Peterson, by spamming Rough Riders, were having a lot of success. I don't believe that those archetypes are entirely dead. However, I do believe that they're going to be much more difficult to play. Because honestly, a lot of those lists spent almost all of their command points throughout the course of the game on reinforcements. The next really big change that the Guard received, or rather the entire game received, is how moving vehicles worked. Previously, based on how the movement would work generally, rotating a Rogal Dorn at 90 degrees would take more than half of its movement. However, they've changed the way that it works, and now models can move in straight lines and pivots. Moving in straight lines is fairly self-explanatory, but pivots are very different. The way that pivots work now are you find the center of the model, and if the model doesn't have a base, you basically do your best. You imagine a rectangle around it, and you find the center of that, and you can pivot your model any amount, and that will cause 2 inches of movement the first time you do it. However, any subsequent pivots that you do not cost additional movement. This makes large vehicles like the Rogal Dorn much more mobile on the board. And generally what that means is, so you can take your Rogal Dorn and you can drive it, and then you can pivot it. And this used to take about 5 inches of movement to get through, but now it only takes 2. And you can move this way, and then you can move back, and then you can move this way, and it's still not going to change anything. So what this effectively does, and really helps out quite a bit, is not necessarily just with the Rogal Dorns, but basically any vehicle, especially Chimeras, that you use to move block. What you can do is normally, if you took your Rogal Dorn and you moved it, that would kind of be where it ends up. However, you can move it and then go like this or this, such that you're completely blocking off and you're using the long side of the Rogal Dorn in order to block any movement from your opponent. Importantly, you can also do really janky things. Like before, we were struggling to really move the turret over the course of the game. However, now if you're doing any pivoting at all, any subsequent pivots, including pivoting the turret, do not cost any additional movement. So you can stick out your gun like this in order to peek this part of the gun around a corner. Or you can poke it out like this in order to deny additional space. Having the footprint like this makes your tank significantly larger, right? Because 9-inch deep strikes have to come off of the barrel. So anything with a rotatable turret suddenly becomes a lot more valuable because of your ability to move it however you need to. That is really big for models like a Hellhound and a Chimera and Lehman Russes that you're sending up the board in order to just create move blocks. And honestly, understanding this will probably be a major distinction between decent players and really strong players who are now able to completely move block your opponents entirely from moving into certain parts of the board. So those are all the major changes that we as the Guard have received. However, let's spend some time to talk about some points in the rules where they have clarified places where the ruling was unclear and or made changes that do in fact change the way the game is played for us. In redeployments, one of the things that this does do is it standardizes when redeployments happen. Before, there are some redeployments that would happen before the first turn roll-off, and there are some redeployments that would happen after the first turn roll-off. Now they are all always before the first turn roll-off. This doesn't change anything for us because Lord Solar is already implied that it was before the first turn roll off, but it does mean that now the attacker will have to do their redeploys before the defender, and this is always going to be the case. Next, firing deck. This didn't change a lot, but it did change in a couple of interesting ways. The first one, you can select up to X models embarked within it whose units have not already shot this phase. Now, this doesn't affect us a whole lot, but what it does do is there was like a little cheese that you could do with rattling snipers where you could disembark them, shoot, use their special rule to re-embark, and then shoot them from firing deck again. That has been removed. However, what it does do is anything that is embarked in a firing deck normally is regiment, or sometimes doesn't have a keyword if you're using Ogren. What this does do now is anything that is firing out of a firing deck gains the squadron keyword. So things like heavy weapons teams are now able to shoot their las cannons with the squadron keyword and get lethal hits against monsters and vehicles. There's honestly nothing that immediately comes to mind where it's like, oh, that's a really broken combination. But it will come up from time to time, and sometimes that little bit of extra firepower can make a big difference. Okay, now this part is kind of hidden in the rules, and I have seen people miss it. I definitely missed it the first time I read it. However, if mortal wounds are being inflicted as a result of the hazardous ability or by an attack with a devastating wounds ability, these mortal wounds do not spill over, which is kind of what they wanted devastating wounds to be in the first place, but now it doesn't really affect us so much, but we'll come back to this in a moment. Another big change that hits guard in particular is this change to indirect fire. If no models in a target unit are visible to the attacking unit when you select that target, blah blah blah, subtract 1 from the attack's hit roll. This is how it used to be. However, it also says an unmodified hit roll of 1 through 3 always fails. Now, there is a bit of a controversy among the guard community that asks about the Daring Recon ability. Daring Recon ability is the name of the Scout Sentinel's ability, which says, blah blah blah, if that attack has the indirect fire ability, it does not suffer the penalty to the hit roll for shooting a target that is not visible to the attacking unit. Now, there are players who claim that this ignores both the -1 to hit, which is absolutely true, and an unmodified hit roll of 1 through 3 always fails can be ignored by a Scout Sentinel. While it will need an FAQ from different tournament bodies at some point, I'm going to go and say right now that if you are planning to play competitively, you should not expect a single TO say that it actually ignores unmodified hit roll. So I would expect that every TO will say that your indirect is still only ever hitting on a 4+ on the dice. Now, there's a couple different things. First one, a lot of our artillery was already looking to hit on 4s by default, right? The Basilisk and the Manticore, without an order, were hitting on a 4+. Our Medusa carriage batteries were hitting on a 4+ when they were ordered. So, what this means is you no longer need to order your Basilisks and your Manticores. However, if you're going to be bringing Medusas, this change doesn't really affect them at all. They were hitting on 4s with an order, and the only way that they would get better than that was if they had a Scout Sentinel removing the indirect penalty, in which case they would be hitting on 3s. But they can't do that anymore. So now, you don't need to order your Basilisks and Manticores. Now, I have already seen that David Gaylord is of the opinion that Manticores are way better because of this, because they have access to rerolls to hit. We'll talk a bit more about that when we actually get towards the Munitorum Field Manual and can talk about how many points it's worth. There is technically a hazardous change that went through, but this doesn't really affect us in any meaningful way. The only thing that it does come up is if you're using like a unit of Scout Sentinels that all have plasma cannons and you roll multiple hazardous checks, they don't spill over from one model to another, but this either does or does not kill anything that we were shooting at anyway. Okay. Next, Devastating Wounds. So before, Devastating Wounds you could not make a saving throw against. However, they once again do mortal wounds. After that attack is allocated and after any modifiers are applied, it inflicts a number of mortal wounds on the target equal to the damage characteristic of that attack, instead of inflicting damage normally. Now, importantly, remember how we were talking about earlier with the mortal wounds. These do not spill over. Right, it will only ever kill one model, which means that the crazy days of Eldar just shooting a flamer and doing a billion damage that would spill over to different targets, that is gone. But importantly, when I first read this, I thought that this would invalidate the Rogal Dorn's ablative plating ability. However, it says after that attack is allocated. However, ablative plating says when an attack is allocated, meaning that the conversion to mortal wounds happens after return the damage to 0. So, you can still use your Rogal Dorn Battle Tank Ablative Plating up against Devastating Wounds. All right, another clarification that has come up. I know I've had at least one person in my YouTube comments bring this up, but for Deep Strike, if a unit with the Deep Strike ability arrives from Strategic Reserves, the controlling player can choose for that unit to be set up either using the rules for Strategic Reserves or using the Deep Strike ability. Now, this doesn't really change anything because this is how everyone was ruling it anyway. However, I had heard a ruling before where reinforcements used to say that you would put Scions in Strategic Reserve when they died. And so there was a question about whether or not they had to walk on from a board edge. Now, this is very obvious. You do not have to do that. Okay, next, Grenade. Grenade was one of the best stratagems in the game that everybody had to kind of use multiple times per game. However, what it used to say was that one grenades unit from your army that has not shot. It has now added a clause where you cannot have advanced or fell back. And this is a strict nerf to anything with grenades that was using it relatively often. I would very often fall back or advance things like Bulgarin in order to make sure I could get into grenade range. However, this no longer works. Otherwise, it functions exactly the same. One thing that is very exciting to us is the change to the tank shock stratagem. Tank shock used to come up every now and then for the guard. However, it has gotten a lot better for us and a lot worse for some other armies, especially things like knights. What this used to say was roll a number of d6 equal to the strength of the highest strength weapon that model is equipped with. However, it now says roll a number of d6 equal to the toughness characteristic of the selected vehicle model. Leman Russes are toughness 11. Previously, we were strength 7, and then if we were higher strength than the toughness, which was true against most infantry, we would roll a couple of extra dice. However, we are now rolling 11 dice consistently instead of only 9. This is a nice buff to us and also really reduces some of the crazy stuff that you could do with Imperial Chaos Knights, where you would consistently be rolling like 20 dice and consistently getting 6 mortal wounds. Now we are fairly consistently getting 3 or 4, so it's much more in line with Grenade across the board. Okay, now this one doesn't jump out at me as having any interactions that I know of that are super important. However, it does now specify that any rules that take place at the start of a phase, turn, or battle round must be fully resolved for any rules that do not specify they take effect at the start of that phase, turn, or battle round. I guarantee this will come up in some rulings that we do, but none of them jump out at me right now. Let me know if there's something that this pops out at you as really mattering for in the comments. Okay, another one that comes up in relation to the Rogal Dorn ablative plating is this one. So previously, the way that every tournament would rule it is as it says currently, where you change the damage characteristic to 0 first, and then Melta 2 comes into place. This has been confirmed as intended by the Games Workshop. Before, it was a bit of a quirk, but now it is like, yep, that's intended. And it's like, okay, thanks, games. The next ruling that has been clarified is out of phase rules. The question is, can a monster or vehicle unit that is within engagement range of one or more enemy units be targeted with the fire Overwatch stratagem because of the big guns never tire rule? And Games Workshop has officially said, no. Big guns never tire allows a unit to shoot in its controlling player's shooting phase, but such rules do not take effect in other phases. Now, this was pretty well established beforehand, at least in the competitive scene. However, the reason why this matters in particular to the guard is the rules for the tank commander. Death befitting an officer. When this model is destroyed, roll 1d6. On a 2+, do not remove it from play. It can, after the attacking model's unit has finished making its attacks, shoot as if it were your shooting phase, and as if it had its full wounds remaining. This model is then removed from play. Then we read Fire Overwatch. If that enemy unit is visible to your unit can shoot that enemy unit as if it were your shooting phase. This is the same. Games Workshop has once again very specifically said that the phrase as if it were does not mean what we want it to mean. This is already how it was ruled by the World Championships of Warhammer, and therefore the WTC, the UKTC, and FLG have all followed suit. The tank commander, if it dies while it is in melee, it does not get to use death befitting an officer. There is one weird exception to this, where if you kill yourself or you somehow die during your own shooting phase, then you can shoot on death. I've never seen it happen, partly because I don't run any hazardous weapons on my tank commanders, but it is there. So just keep that in mind. Death befitting an officer does not work if you are in melee when you die. To really hammer this home, they even added it later in the rules commentary with the big guns never tire out of phase shooting. It's affected by this rule. If they're locked in combat, they cannot make use of any rules that let them shoot in other phases, for example, the fire overwatch stratagem. Alright, those are all the rules that I have found that I know are affecting the guard as is. So let's start talking about the fun part, which is points. For the first time this edition, as far as I know, we've just gotten complete buffs across the board in terms of points. Importantly, Armored Sentinels went down 5 points per model. They used to be 70 points per model. Now you can get one for 65 instead of 70. Now, Armored Sentinels do look a little bit more enticing on this patch because, as they have both the regiment and the squadron keyword, they get lethal hits into everything. I'm definitely going to be experimenting with them a little bit to see if I actually like them. 3 Armored Sentinels for 195 points suddenly looks like a pretty darn good reinforcements target. It is 21 wounds of toughness 8 with a 2-up save that comes back with its new hunter killers. Next, a Basilisk. Basilisk going down to 140 points, I think makes this nearly an auto take in most armies that you're going to be trying to play. It was already popping up in about half to 2/3 of the list that we're actually going 4-1 already, and now it's going to be getting a little bit cheaper. You also don't need to give orders to it, which can be very nice. The Death Strike went down. I think it was like 35 points. I think it used to be like 180. This is still pretty much unplayably bad, but it's cool. Like, if you want to be a bit of a meme lord, like, you can still bring one, and now it's not going to cost you as much. The Field Ordnance Battery went down 10 points. I don't know if this is enough that I would ever really want to bring it, but it's okay. Now that it's going to be getting lethal hits against a lot of the targets that the Bomber Cannon wants to shoot at, it's worth another look. I don't know if I would bring one. They're kind of bad still, but they did pop up in at least one list that did very well recently, in particular at the Bristol Supermajor. Kazarkin! Kazarkin went down 10 points. They were 120 points after being 100, then 120, and now 110. I think a lot of people had the idea that 110 points was probably the right amount of points for Kazarkin to be worth. However, I do wonder if they're now a little bit too high simply because we cannot use reinforcements on them over and over again. Don't know if this is enough to make me want to take Kazarkin. Next, the Manticore went down 15 points. That's cool. I know David Gaylord is already very in favor of these Manticores simply because it's a really good profile for a gun at strength 10, AP 2, damage 3. And even though it's hitting on 4s, if you shoot it into the right targets, and it's going to get full rerolls, meaning that you're going to have a 75% hit conversion, which is pretty darn good. I'm definitely going to be experimenting with them to see if I want to continue bringing them in my list. I think they will make a big splash in teams, but maybe nowhere near as impactful if you're playing in singles games. Now, the one I'm really excited about, the Rogal Dorn Battle Tank went down 20 points. And while the Rogal Dorn did get a little bit weaker into some of its preferred targets like Terminators and Jody's Wardens, it's now cool, right? It's now a better anti-tank tank. And for 20 points cheaper, I'm expecting that a lot of guard players will be seeing success with double Dorns. But those are all the points changes we actually got. So now it's going to be talking about a little bit of the speculation. My initial expectation is that Scion, Russes, and the Rogal Dorn are the big winners that we got on this slate. And these units were already quite good. I've talked a lot about David Purcell and the list that he likes to bring, which was bringing 3 tank commanders and 3 vanquishers, and then some scions as well. And I think that list is looking very, very strong. However, models that I am definitely more interested in now than I was before, firstly, the Leman Norse Exterminator. I just put out a video on this comparing the Leman Norse Exterminator and how effective it was in a lot of armies. Now that it has lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, the damage 3 becomes really, really appealing. So, suddenly, bringing 2 Exterminators looks a lot better than it did before. The other one that I'm really excited about is Scions, because Scions now get lethal hits always. We've already talked about how they are an incredible Overwatch threat if you have both the Tempestus Command Squad as well as the normal Scions, and shooting up against a target that is on an objective, you're nearly overwatching on 3s, because you have a 61% hit conversion. Now that you have lethal hits, it's also better. So especially things like the las guns become way more interesting. One of the things that you can generally think about with lethal hits is that lethal hits is approximately equal to +1 to... It's not exactly equal, but it's pretty close. And so suddenly our hotshot las guns, which are wounding Space Marines on 5s, are now functionally wounding them on 4s in order to try and get a close match. And so Scions, with the ability to deep strike, suddenly become a lot more interesting. because they will be doing a lot of damage to a lot of their preferred targets because they're mostly going to be shooting at elite infantry anyway, right? They were already very good at that. Anything that's toughness 9 or below were their preferred targets, and they are just as good as they were into the targets that they were shooting at before. Things like Tau Riptides, which were toughness 9, you're still going to be doing the same amount of damage to them as you would in the first place. They've only got better against some armies like Orcs or Custodes. The Leman Russ Battle Tank also looks quite good now, simply because it gets access to reroll 1s and it can fish for rerolls against targets that are on objectives. Suddenly, you can go fishing for lethal hits, especially against some of the harder targets, and so the Leman Russ Battle Tank definitely looks better than it used to before. Lastly, the Rogal Dorn Battle Tank. The fact that it went down 20 points per model means that a lot of the armies that are running Dorns were running 2 of them. This is a 40-point discount for a lot of those kinds of lists. And I was already talking to Mike Askey, who went 4-1 at, I believe it was Nottingham earlier this year, saying that his list got quite a bit better. I'm very excited to see what a lot of players will be doing with their Rogal Dorn list going forward. Now, this is going to be my hottest take. I think that these changes that we've received suddenly means that you are not required to be bringing Lord Solar anymore. Lord Solar appeared in almost every list that we had on the April data slate. Of the 35 lists that went 4-1 or better on the last slate, 32 of them brought Lord Solar. I'm going to expect that that number is going to go down. And there's a couple of reasons why I think this might be true. The first one, we do not need nearly as much CP as we used to. When we were spending 6 to 8 CP every game on the reinforcements previously, we don't need to spend that much anymore simply because we can only do it once per game. So the benefit of getting a guaranteed CP every turn is nowhere near as high. However, as Nick Jagello has pointed out, the changes to secondary missions where you can redraw one every turn could put a very heavy CP dependency on our army. So there is still value to getting CP every turn that way. The other major reason why I think Lord Solar might be less common is because a lot of the time he was just there in order to give orders to artillery, especially in a lot of the lists that looked like David Gaylord's, where you would be bringing multiple Manticores and multiple Basilisks. He doesn't need to do that anymore. They're going to be hitting on 4s regardless of whether or not they're ordered. So, those are 2 major parts of Lord Solar's kit that a lot of people will not be needing them anymore. However, Lord Solar is still the only person in the game who can give orders to Bulgrin, to Super Heavies, and to Tank Commanders. So there is still an opportunity to be bringing him. Another reason why is Ursula Creed might actually be able to use the Suppression Fire and Fields of Fire stratagems over and over again in order to try and generate a lot of command points that we were previously not needing because we would get them from Lord Solar anyway. But suddenly, the Voxcaster rule where we can get a new command point on a 4+ is looking much better. I'm still going to argue that Lord Solar is very good, but there's a lot of very good units that you don't necessarily see in every single guard list. So I'm definitely going to be at least experimenting with trying to bring lists that do not have Lord Solar in them. But overall, I'm curious, what do you guys think is good on the new patch? What do you guys think is going to be really strong for us? And in particular, what other armies do you think are going to be better and worse for us to play against? Because there's a lot of changes that have come through. I did not talk about any of the other armies, and I suspect we're actually going to have a much better win rate into Orcs than we were previously. For now, though, I hope you guys have enjoyed this stream of consciousness. It's not something I was necessarily expecting to do, because I did not expect that this data slate was going to be nearly as large. But I wanted to make sure I was able to get this out the day of or the day after that it came out so that we could talk about it. A couple of other plans that are coming up. So firstly, the Leman Russ videos that I was working on. As I already mentioned in a post, my mental health has been in the gutter for a little while. So that was already a little bit delayed. It's going to be delayed even further for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I'm going to be traveling quite a bit. I'm going back up to Seattle for a little while, and then I will be traveling to the Middle East for about a week. If you know anything about me other than my 40K content, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out why. But it's really important to me that when I make the officer training school videos, I actually have useful things to say, which are actually well established, especially by strong players. Well, we have a lot of strong players who have strong opinions about different units that are good and bad right now. We haven't necessarily seen the playtest come through yet, and I want to make sure that I can give a lot of players time to actually figure out exactly how strong they think different units are. And also, I'm going to need time to play with some of this stuff myself in order to give you guys the best information that I can. So I would say this will probably be my last video until second, third week of July. So for now, once again, this has been Joshua Joshi Howard. Thanks for tuning into this, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.